Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BoF Careers webinar series, Building a Career in Fashion. Many apologies for the delayed start and the change in location, but hopefully you've all managed to make it here. A thank you also to our guest, Jess Christie, Chief Brand and Content Officer at MatchesFashion's as well, for joining us today and for your patience in us getting started.
No problem.
I am your host, Sophie Soar, Commercial Features Manager at the Business of Fashion, and I am delighted to welcome Jess on our webinar series today, also on International Women's Day. This event falls during BoF Careers Week, for which we have a whole host of exciting content and live events on BoF, as well as over 4,000 jobs available on businessofashion.com/careers. The purpose of this event specifically, though, is to share Jess's experience in building her career, and in doing so, identify some actionable insights that you can incorporate into your own career development. This conversation is specially designed for our applicant community, throughout which we will aim to answer as many of your questions as possible, many of which we've already seen coming through on the LinkedIn landing page. So please do continue to send those through on the chat. So we will start at the beginning of Jess's career, how she progressed, and finally her experience as a leader in the industry. But before we get started, a little bit of information on Jess. She studied English literature at university, during which time she worked on the shop floor of Gap before transitioning into its in-house PR team. After university, Jess moved to luxury fashion PR agency Brower Lewis, representing the likes of Jimmy Choo, Anya Hindmarsh, and Net-a-Porter, before returning to Gap Inc. to launch Banana Republic in the UK and Europe, and overseeing Gap Inc.'s collaborations with the likes of Valentino and Stella McCartney. Then in 2011, Jess made the move to luxury e-commerce platform MatchesFashion's, starting as Global Communications Director, and she led the launch of Matches concept store and events hub Carlos Place, and joined the C-suite as Chief Brand Officer in 2018. So Jess has extensive experience in PR, marketing, and indeed retail, an industry that has evolved significantly since the pandemic shuttered stores across the globe and forced many retail businesses online almost overnight. So among her list of responsibilities today, Jess manages a team of about 180, I believe, in retail, brand marketing, content design, creative, PR, partnerships, visual merchandising, and many more besides that. Before we get into Jess's advice then for those looking to break into and indeed build a career in the many different areas of the fashion industry that she oversees, I want to start first by asking you, Jess, why the fashion industry? What drew you to building a career in fashion?
Yeah, good question, Sophie, because it's always actually one of the hardest questions, because I was drawn to fashion out of interest. It was always an interest of mine. But I think more broadly, I was really interested in quite a lot of different things. So I was really interested in film and art and literature. And actually, to be honest, I think at school, I wasn't really sure what you did do with that. And I think I thought, it's a very long time ago, I was quite literal that the fashion industry was if you were a fashion designer, which I didn't think was necessarily my skill set. So I sort of parked the idea of fashion and went down the English literature route at university, but was still really kind of open to what I was doing. And actually I did a lot of work experience. So I originally thought it was more journalism. And then kind of, I think when you and I chatted before, the thing that came to me about fashion is it was just that interest. And so it kept coming back. And so when I started working in the shop in Gap on the shop floor, but I was also studying English literature, these ideas, and I started discovering what PR was and communications, it sort of all came together really. But it was pretty broad initially, and it certainly was not something I was fixed on or already knew about. I don't think I knew how many jobs there were within the fashion industry.
And I mean, you started in retail as well, working on the shop floor, as I mentioned. So whilst you were doing that, what was the first thing you learned from that first job on the shop floor in fashion?
I learned about the customer. So it was fascinating. I worked in Gap in High Street, Kensington at the end of the 90s when Gap was in a real sort of heyday. And I really loved it. It was great. I realized I really liked selling things. So that was a really good realization amongst the arts and everything else. I found it really satisfying selling things. And I learned really quickly that it was about connection. So it was all about the connection with the customer, and how you made them feel good about wearing clothes, and that was a lot of fun, actually. And I found retail super interesting, the strategy behind it. And I think Gap was a great place to start, because even when you worked in the shop floor at Gap, they really trained you. So you got a lot of training into the mechanics, I would say, and almost the logistics of retail and what everything meant. And you were expected to be super knowledgeable. So it was a lot of fun.
And you transitioned then from the shop floor, though, to their in-house PR team, which is not necessarily the most usual transition to make in a career. Like, how did you manage to make that transition? What skills did you demonstrate?
It's probably one of the things I would advise people most, is being kind of like really open and curious, but also telling people that you want to try things. And I think when I was there, it was, as I said, a really interesting time for Gap in terms of how that brand was growing and expanding in the UK. And I made it very clear to the management team there that I was really interested in, if there were other opportunities, I would do work experience or try things. So people knew that I was interested in that. And I'd also done some work experience in another PR agency, not fashion. It was an agency called Hobsbawm Macaulay, and they actually launched wallpaper, and they were doing Vanity Fair. And so again, I was kind of interested in this idea. I'd started being interested in the idea of PR. So I told the people I worked with and chatted with them. And so when they started needing some help, more ad hoc initially in the press office, they sort of said, would you like to go and do that? Which I was very, very excited that this was going to be like this massive break. And so I went to do that. And my experience of working in the press office initially was literally one whole week in a cupboard under the stairs, folding denim. But it was the beginning, of starting a relationship. And then I get called in regularly to go and help in the press office, and started doing that more and more.
So how did you then, I guess, from the working,
get out the cupboard?
Get out the cupboard. I guess how did you get out the cupboard and then start moving up in the sort of more corporate end, I suppose, of the creatively corporate end of the business?
Yeah, I think it was just being kind of, I really enjoyed learning about all the different aspects of the business side, but also I wanted to do the more creative side. So essentially, I just think I tried to be really helpful. and when I got things to do, like folding denim under the stairs, I just did it as well as I could, and then tried to absorb as much of what was going on around me. And you get asked to do more and more, I think, in that sort of situation. And I think showing that kind of willingness, and then if you get given a job to do and you do it well, you get given more jobs to do. And that's basically what happened. And gradually I started learning all of the different the jobs really within a working press office and communications team, which was great.
At what point did you also decide then that the PR was the avenue that you initially wanted to go down? Like, how did you make that decision when you, as you said, were balancing up the idea of a love of creative and a love of and being interested in the corporate?
Quite quickly, actually, because that was what was brilliant about doing the different work experience. I'd done work experience in this PR agency, which had been really dynamic and buzzy and very social, which I liked as well. So it was sort of hard work, but I really liked the way that you worked with a team. It was very collaborative, very creative, even when it was over something that could be seen to be quite boring. It was really about how could you do it to make it more interesting? How were you going to engage? How were you going to get the media to pay attention to a story? What was the angle? And then the Gap press office, very similarly, like once I got out of the cupboard, and even within the cupboard, I kind of learned that you could do, it was very different every single day, because it was whether you were launching an ad campaign, with Missy Elliott, or then you would be doing the launch of a new store and thinking about how you would do a kids party in the store. And then you would be thinking about, how you were going to do a press day or a different type of event. So I really like the different facets to it. And it felt like a very good combination, and still does, a very good combination of lots of different areas. So it had a real sense of being dynamic and creative, but quite purposeful, which is what I learned at Gap, I think, was there was a lot of like strategy, and it was quite measured, which was great.
And then I suppose from being in-house at Gap, you then went to an agency. Why did you make that transition? What skills did you learn as well from an agency that expanded upon what you were learning from in-house roles?
Yeah. It definitely wasn't some great insight or foresight of mine. Somebody told me to. So I think it was a headhunter, which I'll always remember because they called me trying to place somebody at Gap. And I was talking to them generally about my career and what they thought of my career to date. And I'd been at Gap for a little while and I'd left university. It had become a full-time job. And they said to me, well, it's brilliant that you've got all this experience in-house, but really, the next thing you would do is you work in a PR agency because you're going to work with different clients, and also you've worked in something that's high street, but it would be good to get luxury and more diversity, and it's a very different skill working in an agency to working in-house. And I sort of thought, okay, that's interesting. And they said, so do you want to go and do these interviews for these agencies? And that's how I went and met the team at Brower Lewis, and I went into a role in that agency. So it happened very naturally, but because I took advice that it was a good idea for my career. And my God, it was so different. It couldn't have been, I don't think actually anything initially prepared me for how different working in an agency environment was to Gap. And initially, I think I thought I'd stepped sort of into the doors of absolutely fabulous because it was so different. And it was in this kind of crazy, beautiful townhouse, and it was dogs and people and babies. And but it was really, and I think the thing it really taught me there was, real kind of resilience and a different kind of hard work and pace. Like there's amazing pace at an agency like that, but it was very exciting and dynamic. And what I loved there as well is that Tracy and Natalie, who ran the agency, they really believed in you. So it was very much, there was no kind of, we're going to go through things slowly, etc. It was very much like, these are your clients, go meet them, go talk to them, pitch ideas, but, nothing was kind of off the table. So you learn a lot, you made lots of mistakes, you learned more, you adjusted, but it was that kind of freedom. And again, very, very collaborative in that team.
And speaking of making mistakes as well, was there any in particular that stood out at the beginning of your career that you then went on to learn from?
I mean, Sophie, the mistakes question is fabulous for everybody to take from, because you make so many mistakes, and I still make mistakes. We all still make mistakes. So there are, and it sounds like a cliche to say some of the best mistakes, teach you things. They absolutely do, but they're mortifying, and especially at the beginning of your career. And I guess that's the resilience piece, to learn to get over them, because it's fine. But I think my absolutely worst, that still, I can remember the wanting to, die within, was that I looked after Diane von Furstenberg, and she was launching beauty. So we decided that was the opportunity, that it was a good idea for a really big reach to take her onto GMTV and do Lorraine Kelly. And it was when the wrap dress was in the height, and the interview went well, even though I wouldn't say that's naturally the most obvious matches, etc. And Diane was doing very early in the morning for Diane, GMTV. She was doing very well with Lorraine, and they'd gone through, that Madonna was wearing the wrap dress and all the different pictures, and interview went well. And as she was walking off the set, Lorraine had 5 models walking on in the cheapest copy wrap dresses you've ever seen in your life. Oh, no. And so Diane left stage, and on these 5 high street rip-off Diane von Furstenberg wrap dresses walk on, and Diane was really not very impressed. And it's one of those moments where you're sat in agreement, and there's nothing you can do. It's live TV. You can't be even a bullshit sort of PR at that point. Like, there was no stopping it, and no coming back from that one for a while. And you have to just go, yeah, that's bad. And fully embrace the hideousness of the situation and learn from it.
Yeah, completely. A question actually that's come through from the audience is if there is, in which particular sort of PR, comms and marketing roles there are particularly big demand for entry-level workers at the moment. Is there any kind of insight you have there?
I think it's interesting that what I'm definitely seeing a lot is, to your point before, that a lot of people are trying to build out digital comms even more. So doing PR, but people being very aware of, I would say, for entry level, a skill set which probably crosses into some social awareness. So I think it's becoming where PR and comms used to be, very media specific, it's kind of crossing even at entry level into awareness about social talent, who else are kind of acting like media now. So I think that, and I think most companies are looking for that within their entry-level PR roles. And there's definitely more investment happening across the board in this digital comms piece.
And are there any sort of specific soft skills as well that you think are particularly useful and relevant in progressing as well from into that entry-level role that you think is important to demonstrate?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that the thing that you need to do at the entry level, and I mean, I do think it stays with you, but it's very important at that entry level, is this idea of resilience and being adaptable. Because I think that and you already just asked it, that the industry is already changing so much that when people come in, any of us come in, I think we're challenged, and you have to embrace the challenge and be ready to adapt and be quite resilient, that if it doesn't meet your expectations, that you can kind of pivot with it and do that with a sense of curiosity and enjoyment, as opposed to just thinking this isn't what I signed up for. Because I think when you're going in at entry level, it's very, very hard for things to necessarily meet your expectations, because everything has changed so much in the last 2 years, and it was changing before, but it's gone really fast now. So I think that it's really going in there and being open in terms of the fact that it is going to be, it's good when things are dynamic, but a lot of people struggle with being adaptable and then having that resilience just to not take it personally.
Sure. You just brought up as well about the last couple of years, obviously, in the evolution that has come about in the workplace. And a question that has come through from an audience member is how the pandemic has changed the work environment within the fashion industry. You've just mentioned, the involvement more of like technology, for instance. Yeah. Is there anything further you would add to that?
I think there's things that have been really good about it, and I think it's amazing that technology has enabled us to keep working to the level that we have through the pandemic. I think it's probably been a really challenging time to start jobs. So when you are entry level, I think that's very difficult when you can't physically be a part of some of the culture. I think you should be able to do a lot, and it's great that we can be more agile in our working and more global. But yes, I think it's super important to form connections too, and you learn so much, I think, at the beginning through kind of osmosis, right? Like you make mistakes, you see things, you ask. So I think that the thing that, again, in being adaptable, is for everybody who's sort of starting out, to still make sure they're doing that, they're having the opportunity to ask the questions, or whether that is digitally or at the opportunities when people are getting back together physically. And I think that is going to be very important for people.
And as I mentioned earlier as well, you're running teams of, I think it's 180 individuals in the teams that you're running at the moment at Matches. How is it, do you think, what advice would you have for standing out in then a virtual working environment and ensuring that people are able to get their message across and be able to communicate effectively and stand out to you as the C-suite leader of those teams?
For me, I'm continually impressed when people ask questions. Now, obviously, that could backfire on you, right, with too many questions, but you'd be surprised. I think the thing that my advice would be on that, and somebody did it the other day, and I was so impressed, Florent, who's in our French team, but he just reached out and he'd been thinking about something and how potentially to connect some teams together who work in different locations. A lot of people are remote, and he asked me some questions, but also had some ideas, and I think that's really brilliant. And of course, there's times when that's not, you can't have 180 people all speaking at once, but you'd be surprised how often, I think sometimes now, people don't say what they're thinking or ask the questions. And I think that I really notice when people ask me questions. I really like it, because it kind of, you can tell someone's thinking and they've listened probably to ask the question. And I think I would really encourage people to do that more. I mean, you've always got to use your instincts about when and how much, and I think it depends on what you're comfortable with. But I would encourage people, as I was saying today, you can't say like the new normal, because people have been saying that also for 2 years, so there's no normal times like what. But I think that where the opportunity is right, see people in person when you can. Remember those, like, your soft skills points. Sometimes it is saying, can I find 10 minutes to have a coffee with you, or to ask you about this, or to but I think that's how you do stand out, and you find the way that you're comfortable doing that. But that's a good thing to do.
To build on that point as well, do you have any sort of particular recommendations or advice around networking when you're starting out, and how to really make an impact in standing out to those people you are reaching out to and suggesting a meeting in person, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I'd say about thinking like where and how it's appropriate when you're starting out. For me, it's always been about kind of trying to make the connections deep with the people who, once you have met them, as opposed to the kind of cold calling networking. That's better. That was always, in my experience, better. And I've always I've preferred that, but it's probably that's more my style of communication, is that I do like, everyone jokes with me that I still really like calling people as opposed to doing too many emails. And I like that real-time connection. But other people, I think, are really happy to do things in different ways. So part of it's also figuring out or being open to the different styles of communicating that there are. But I also don't underestimate, I think, with networking, I think sometimes there's this idea of more is more, you know what I mean? And it's got to be the numbers and go to lots and make loads of connections. I've always found it's like often the people that you do know, and it's spending more time with them. And if it's quite natural, then it tends to be there's an introduction, or it can happen quite organically. I would always advise not to force it too much.
Sure. And just to bring it back as well to something we were talking about earlier, just in terms of the evolution of the workplace and the industry in the last couple of years, I wondered if we could hone in a little bit more specifically then on the changing nature of retail and e-commerce. And if you can share a little bit of your view in how much the industry has changed and what kind of skill sets you think people need now to work in this area.
I mean, to me, I think it's changed, but as I said, I think it's escalated probably a change that was already happening. And I think that what it comes down to is, a strong brand is an engaging one, and you've got to always think about the customer. And I think that sometimes when there are these questions about the future of retail or how retail should be, and fundamentally, it's the first thing I learned on the shop floor was it's like, how do you engage and connect to the customer? And people forget that, and I think about lots of other things, and you do need to really come back to the customer and the customer's behavior. And the fact is now that with the customer, what we're seeing is they're increasingly global, they're increasingly they don't want their life to be siloed. There is a speed and convenience that has to be met, like the expectation. I mean, that's incredible now how fast everyone expects everything. The world coming back to being more physical is really funny, because everyone was used to just sitting on Zoom and getting hold of everyone instantly because everyone was sat at a screen. Now they're not, and travel's happening again. So I think that if you can always remember, everyone's got to keep moving forwards and keep evolving, keep looking forwards. But I think keeping that customer in mind, and also what is your point of difference, the brand's point of difference, understanding and owning that point of view is super important, and will continue to be. I think it will continue to make the difference.
A question from somebody in our audience as well, Mia, has asked, what is your opinion as well on diversity, equity and inclusion in retail today? And how do you think companies are creating paths to improve in these areas?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think that's one that, again, we need to be much more open and keep being very curious about, and keep being challenged on in terms of what's happening there. I think companies are making interesting strides about it by trying to remove some of the barriers that used to be there. So I think there used to be far too many barriers about whether it was internship programs where even the specifications weren't right, or at least they were restrictive, I would say. And I think that one of the things that we've been trying to do a lot more is ask those questions about how do you remove some of those barriers it's unconscious bias, but it's bias to expect people to have been to university. Is that necessary for some of these? No. So remove that. So it's removing some of those things. Then I think it's about trying to plug in with more different organizations so that you can really attract a wider range of talent. Because I think a lot of people who aren't, it's quite rarefied to understand, for instance, what jobs are there still in fashion, right? So you've got to be more open in working with different community projects, different education ideas, I think, to open up the pool of talent, because it's out and you need it, actually, because otherwise it starts to really lack a relevancy and you're not going to connect with the customer. So I think that I think things are happening, but it needs to continue, and we need to continue to be challenged and listen to people so that we can adapt.
To your point as well about education, another question that came through is about whether you think fashion education is necessary to have a fashion career. You yourself have a background of a university degree, and you just mentioned as well that you're not necessarily sure if that is.
Well, listen, I absolutely think university and like education is brilliant, you know, and I loved doing the English literature degree. Did I need it for my career? No. And I have said this so many times. What's more, no one's even ever asked me. I think you're the only person who's probably ever referenced the fact that I got a degree. So at no stage in my working life was I ever asked about, I wasn't even asked about my A levels. So, and I definitely don't think to do fashion, you need to do a degree or a fashion degree. Equally, if that's your passion and you're interested and you're curious, I think it's a brilliant thing to do. So, but I would never, it's never been a requirement. I don't think it bears as much relevancy. I think unless it means something to you and that deepens your understanding and what you're curious about and what you love and what you're interested in, actually, because you'll get something out of it if it's what you're really interested in and you want to study. And some people, that's exactly what they want, but it definitely isn't. I definitely don't think it's a must.
And then a few others sent in questions around what sort of courses and how you can educate yourself in terms of trying to work in an industry to stand out. If there's any good courses or books that you might have to recommend, ways to reach out without pestering people.
Yeah. I was thinking about that after I said it, because I was like, it's such a good question, because it's really difficult, because it's such a fine line. And I was going to say, the thing I think in terms of, for me, I think there are lots of different courses that you can look into doing. And the beauty of online now is some of these are online courses, right? So whereas they used to be, I think, much more restrictive, I think you can look and you can see what digital options there are now, including shorter courses, which I think is really good. But to me, the thing I would say, and some of the best people that I've hired from entry-level position, I would almost say it's like go to everything you can go to and try as many different things. So, and those aren't things that always have to be expensive, but it's like go to the V&A and go to Fashion in Motion whenever you can go to Fashion in Motion, you know, go to the exhibition. But to me, I think you will meet more people in that way that you can talk to who might become a connection almost than anything else. It's like try as much as you can and just go to many different types of things. And I think the thing that's brilliant now is that fashion is, you know, fashion is less siloed, as I was saying. So actually people are really interested, and that's another way you can reach out. I think there's great ways of reaching out through social media. You know, we were saying already, like, though the technical difficulties didn't back us up, but that LinkedIn is becoming way more powerful as a form of social media. So I'm not advising people to harass people all the time in LinkedIn, but you can watch what's happening more. Are there things that you join through that way? Can you try different cultural events and activities depending on where you are, both physically and online? And I think that is a great way to meet people and just be open. And by that, I mean, you have to be quite brave and talk to people at things if you can.
Well, I was also going to mention that it was when you were working at the PR agency, wasn't it, that you met Tom and Ruth, yes, who founded Matches.
They were clients, but yeah.
And they were clients. Okay. So how did you then sustain that relationship? Because you then went back to Gap Inc. How did you sustain that relationship over the years to then end up working at Matches?
Yeah. So what I did with Tom and Ruth was, so we worked together in Browers in the agency. And then when I left over a 3-year period, I basically just always checked in and always watched what they were doing, and also always tried to still be helpful. Like, I mean, I think that's what I think is probably one of the most useful pieces of advice, is if you're there and you notice things and you check in with people usually respond quite well. It's quite human, but it does work. And I think with Tom and Ruth, I always stayed in touch. I came to things when they were doing new projects, when they opened a new store or anything else. I would always come and I would always send a note or sort of check in, and they would ask my advice sometimes. So we stayed in touch in that way. It was almost like it's a conversation. And whenever you meet people, if you can keep a bit of a conversation going, and there can be big gaps in that conversation, but yeah, it's good. And it kind of keeps you a bit more top of mind. And I think then when Tom and Ruth were ready to really think about how they were going to do that transformation from online to being so much more of a digital and global presence, they didn't offer me a job. They called me initially to ask me about people they could hire, and then we started talking and they asked me to come in. So it was a conversation.
And as well, then thinking about your team within Matches too, what is it that you're looking for in terms of skill sets as people are progressing up and you're having those conversations about ways in which they can prove to you that they are worth taking that next step in their career at Matches?
Yeah, and I would say as well, actually, we have one of the things I really love about Matches is that we have worked with a lot of people who did join us from the retail environment, internship programs, all sorts. I've actually a couple of people who are really senior in the team now, have joined really from internship level, which is, I think, brilliant, and means they've learned in a really unique way. And I think the thing that I feel that I'm being really repetitive in that sort of sense, but it is that kind of like the people who do really well, I think they have that ability to move with change in that kind of open way where it's energizing, not de-energizing. I think they're really happy to be challenged. And it's something that, I've definitely learned. I learned it really from Tom and Ruth. I learned it from my first boss, Anita, who was brilliant at Gap. They make you better if you respond to the challenge positively, if you see it as a positive, as opposed to taking it personally and as a negative. And I think that's really important, because when you're working in a creative but a business, you're always kind of marrying the creativity and freedom with a commerciality, and they need to go together. They should be really complementary, not poles apart. So you need to know that if somebody is challenging you on something, it can have really good reason behind it. So learn from that, ask the questions, so that you have you show that it's that work ethic, isn't it, that you show that engagement, that you care. But I think that's the thing. And I think also have a sense of humor. I mean, it's really like, I think the people who do really well as well have that sense of humor. So it's like they really own when they make a mistake, and they're really open and they ask good questions, and they take the job seriously, but they also have that sense of humor about it as well sometimes, which is really important to know that, it was just today and tomorrow's going to be a better day, and keep on going.
In the last couple of minutes, Jess, I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions that came through from our audience as well. One of which is quite broad. How can one have a sustainable career in the industry?
I think that's a really good question. I think it comes back though to this ability to change. So, and it's the curiosity point. I think if you stay, particularly, maybe it's in any industry now, and certainly potentially COVID's taught us that, but I think that if you stay very rigid in your idea, even if you're really good at your job, it's very hard to progress, I think, ultimately, because you will reach that ceiling, or things will change around you and you can end up being defensive and not moving. And I think that you have to keep having that openness to change and that's what I mean about challenge as well. Like if you're doing a really good job, being challenged to think how you could do it differently and better is really important, I think. And not seeing that as being like, but why would I do that? And I think when you look at brands, I always kind of think back to the brand point, like brands where it doesn't work is because they're almost not prepared to change. And to listen to the customer and listen to feedback. And I feel like that's true for the individual. And that's another really good point from both the question around how do you enter and progress, and then to the broader question about how do you have longevity, is probably to keep work. It's like do your own work, right? Like everyone needs to keep working on themselves, and like, what's your purpose? What makes you enjoy your job? And I would say that's a really important part when I'm developing the team, is people won't necessarily just recognize your own brilliance and promote you. So if you can think about how you have the dialogues about what you want, where do you want to stretch, what would you like to do more of, no boss or leader is ever going to be upset by someone usually saying that they want to do more. Yeah. And it's such a good conversation if you see that, so the change, and also say, I'm really interested in learning more about this area, or I'd love to join this project if there's any ability, or I love it when people say that to me, and it doesn't always have to be about the remuneration of that, it's the experience of that. And I think that as you get more and more experience, then you open yourself up to having to keep progressing and evolving your career, and I guess that's how you can keep moving forwards.
And I suppose as well, outside of then those skill sets and improving upon those within your specific area, what other advice would you have for outside of your particular team or your particular function at work? What other recommendations would you have to be able to get involved with the wider business in that respect?
But I think that's a great question as well. And I think that when you're asking to be curious about things, that applies to being quite cross-functional as well. So I think the thing that I've really always enjoyed is, that you should understand how the DC works. And that's quite fascinating to understand enough about logistics and the retail element. And the buying is something that, you need to know loads about. If you're going to then be really think of successful marketing campaigns around product, you've got to really know and read that. So that's what I mean. I think that always having the broader interest in trying to experience more things outside of your job description, I would say, is really good. And to see everything as being an opportunity. And if it's not for you, it's not for you. You don't need to necessarily do it again. But anything you can do to get a better understanding, I think, of the industry more broadly and things outside it as well. I think it's sort of, that's kind of the do as many things as you can part, for me, I think, is really important.
Without stretching yourself too thin.
Yeah. Well, I also think there's a point at which, you can, and then you go, and then you have to discover, then you put some more boundaries back in. So that's the point, isn't there? There's points where it's like, stretch yourself, realize you've gone a bit too thin, bring it back in. But, I think that it has to be a natural sort of push-pull, because I think that for all of us, and I think that it's very dangerous, isn't it? If you become too insular, it's like if you only read 2 publications, or if you only look at one channel. And I guess that's the other thing I would encourage people to do, is to make sure that, to read or watch or kind of experience things a bit more broadly as well, because you get more ideas from that.
Unfortunately, Jess, we are now at time. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. Again, everybody, very sorry about the late start, but thank you for tuning in. And don't forget to visit BoF Careers to check out the latest job opportunities, content and advice from industry leaders such as Jess. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. And